What's the intersection between pastoring and leading? We're talking about that today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, I'm so glad that we are talking about leading as S-type leaders today. And I'm glad we're talking about it because that's not either of us. So
I was going to say, maybe we should have invited one.
No, I think this is good. I think that actually we encounter a lot of S-type leaders.
Yeah.
And partner with a lot of us. In fact, I believe I should have looked this up before we hit record, but I think that the S type on the DiSC is actually statistically the largest group in out of people generally. I think it's something like maybe 60% of people are an S type.
Oh, that's interesting. Interesting fact. I would have expected the DiSC to be just more even, but I would have expected it to be the highest among pastors.
Yeah, it is in fact the highest among pastors. So just to kind of refresh, if you're like just tuning into this episode and haven't listened to the last 2 weeks, we're doing a Deep on DiSC series. And this is the third week in this series. We are talking about leading as what it's like to lead depending on your type, your temperament type. So the DiSC, just to kind of refresh everybody, there's 4 key types: the D, the I, the S, and the C. There's 2 axes. There's a horizontal axis from task orientation to people orientation. And then there's a vertical axis from introversion on the bottom to extroversion on the top. And so we've talked about the D, which is task oriented and extroverted. We've talked about the I, which is people oriented and extroverted. And today we're talking about the S, which is people oriented and introverted. Introverted, I think, needs to be explained a little bit, AJ. I think even the extroversion, introversion, I think when I'm saying extroverted, it's like outgoing and risk taking, versus introversion being more reserved, more
introspective, cautious,
risk averse. Yeah. So introverted doesn't necessarily, I don't mean that necessarily to mean doesn't like to be around people. In fact, they're people oriented. So, but they're smaller conversations, more interested in that slower interaction and so on. They're not going to want to work a room. So today we're talking about the S, which S stands for steady. And I always like to say that the S, AJ, could just as easily stand for shepherding, because that's really, really their heart. And so today in the teaser, you mentioned we're kind of talking about this intersection between pastoring and leading. There's some Venn diagram of overlap between these things, but to have a pastor's heart is not always exactly the same as what it takes to really lead out in front. And it's this intersection and this mix that can be difficult, I think, for the S-type leader. And so we're going to be talking about that today.
Yeah, it really can be a challenge to balance the necessities of successful leadership and the desires for effective care for people and shepherding. So it's a really interesting challenge, I think, for senior pastors that fall into the S on the DiSC. So glad we're bringing this up.
So just a brief reminder, again, the way that we're structuring these episodes and the article that goes along with it, we're starting with the strengths of this temperament type, the challenges of this temperament type, and then kind of wrapping up with a key to success. And so with that, maybe let's hop into the strengths of being an S-type leader.
Yeah. So and we're staying with the same format. We've got 3 strengths and 3 challenges. So our first strength that we're talking about today is having this genuine empathy for the congregation. This comes naturally to the S-type leader, this care for people and this understanding of what's happening with them and how they feel about it. So and people love this about others, right, Scott? I mean, to know that somebody truly, they care for you and they kind of get where you're coming from and how you're feeling. I mean, that meets a real need in, human emotion and relationships, which makes it totally understandable while this type of person would actually, by almost all accounts, be considered maybe successful in ministry, that they care deeply for people and people know that they genuinely care for them. And then of course that, that challenge, that intersection then of leadership is where the challenge comes in for these type of leaders. But as far as having genuine empathy for people, gosh, the S is who you want to go to talk about things.
Yeah, usually really good at counseling, usually really good at doing the hospital visits. I always like to joke that I'm terrible at those things. Like, if you're in the hospital, you really don't want me to show up, because I'm probably going to crack a joke. I really don't know how to act in those situations. But an S-type leader always does. And they're the person that you want to show up when you're sick. And this is why people like them as a pastor, because they're usually very caring. They're going to sit and they're going to listen to your problems, and they're going to be very patient with you and be very caring. And it's not feigned. They really mean it. It's they genuinely care. And so a real strength of the S-type, as you said, AJ, is this genuine empathy that they have. They can feel other people's pain, and it comes out in their preaching. It comes out in all this, that they really care about people.
Yeah, for sure. This is I'm not an S, doesn't come naturally to me. Something that I think in all of the 4 types, you can learn things about yourself, and you can try to employ skills and techniques to be better in the areas that you're not strong in. Empathy for me is one that I have to be conscious of, and try to ask questions of people and kind of, draw some understanding of what they're going through. But certainly comes easy for these people, and I appreciate that about them. I wish I had that just natural thing, where you can just really connect with somebody like that and hear about them. Our second strength is that they understand how change is going to impact the whole ethos of the church. They've got their finger on the pulse of the overall kind of feeling of the congregation. And this is a really interesting innate ability to not only have an understanding about an individual, but kind of feeling what's going on in the space altogether. How are we kind of doing together as a group? We'll talk about a little bit of perhaps a misunderstanding when we talk about challenges in the same regard. But these are the people that they might be able to tell you about kind of what's the word on the street, what's going on with the folks.
Yeah, I've learned, the older I've gotten and the more I've led, the more I learned to trust these instincts in an S-type leader when I'm working with one. I can think of I don't want to share names or specific circumstances, but I can think of a recent instance in working with a church where my desire had been to kind of push harder on a particular change, or really more pace of change, going, we really need to execute on these things. And had gotten some feedback from an S-type leader in their church. And his perspective was, hey, we need these couple of things to happen. Otherwise, we're going to get a lot more resistance than we should get. And my as a DI type leader, personally, my instinct was to dismiss this and go, yeah, well, things are a problem because you've let these kinds of attitudes, drive the ship up to this point. But I took some time, thought about what he was saying, and thought, you know what, this is probably true. He's probably right. And we can't make those kinds of, we'll talk about this with challenges. We can't let these perceptions of, how change is going to impact the church keep us from making changes. But, totally ignoring what's happening at the congregational level and just plowing through, that can be dangerous also. And so you should, if you aren't an S-type leader like me, you should listen to those folks, because they usually do have a good pulse. And if you can respond appropriately, not overreact to what they're saying, but respond appropriately, they can really help you avoid a pothole or two.
Yeah.
And if you are an S-type leader, you should trust that instinct, but not too much. Again, we'll talk about that in the challenge section. But you probably do have a good inclination on what people are thinking and how a change is going to impact the church.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of with you on this kind of same situational anecdote of listening to the S's. And every strategic leadership team that we work with in a church ends up with some S-type people on it. I think, God is good about giving us these kind of personality mixes whenever the church is working through processes with us on health. But yeah, those are the folks that a lot of times you'll get to know about, some past hurts in the church or some things that have not been working well, from a relational and emotional level. And, well, again, my natural instinct might be to like, just gloss over that and like, whatever, let's just get to work.
Grow up. Put your big foot down.
Yeah, let it go. I mean, I've just learned over the years, just gained skills as a facilitator with churches to go ahead and maybe even probe into these things and allow some space for those conversations to happen, not to let it derail or to even really delay, but to allow some breathing room for people to express these things, talk it out a little bit. And sometimes, then you can learn more about the church as well to know, well, okay, maybe like you were saying, maybe our first idea here may not be the right way to go. Maybe we do need to slow down or shift that a little bit. But yeah.
On this note, before we move past this, they might be annoyed by church politics, but usually the S-type leaders are good at managing them. Because there's the process for change on paper, and then there's the real process for how things happen.
Yeah.
And they're usually very well versed in understanding how that works. Yeah. They may hate all of that, and probably do, but they probably understand it very well. And so if you're not an S-type leader, and it's easier, I guess, to talk about it from that perspective since I'm not one, but you should lean on those folks a little bit and go, okay, if I really want this to happen, how do I need to do this? And they'll tell you because they likely really know.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, our third strength of the S-type leader, or the steady or shepherding type leader, is that people feel known and cared about in the church. And this is something that ends up getting projected. Of course, Aubrey would always say, as the leader goes, so goes the church. And that kind of goes down into this type of thing. Especially if you have a senior pastor that's more of an S, and he is a pretty good communicator and has some leadership qualities to him about wanting to make sure that kind of the feel of the church does impact the entire church, then you'll see this. And I like one of the notes that you put in here, Scott, is that these are the churches that guests or people that have been there for a while would talk about feeling welcome, feeling
just feel at home. It feels warm here.
Yeah, right. So this is the kind of thing that a good S leader can end up helping to permeate throughout varying levels of leadership in the church, so that it becomes, I don't want to keep using the word ethos, but it becomes the ethos of the church, that it projects this feeling. And again, this is a really positive relational, emotional thing that humans will connect with.
Yeah, that's right. So we're going to get into the challenges, but there can be too much of a good thing. Yeah. But what tends to happen is there's this sense of, well, this is our home, this is our family, it feels warm. And so it can start to create almost even like a barrier to growth, because people are afraid of, if we grow, will we lose this sense of connection, of the sense of family? And to be honest, done well, the answer would be no, because this person, if they're leading really well, can project that, as you were saying, AJ, that same culture and feeling beyond himself, beyond the leader himself. And so that it can grow, so that as the church grows, it continues to have this feel. It's a hard thing to do, and it requires a really skilled S-type leader, usually in partnership with some other leadership types, to make that happen. But, if you can do this, we're talking about strengths right here. If you can manage that, if you can thread that needle, it's a really beautiful thing. And it tends to lead to a church where people want to stay for the long haul, because they feel really cared about, and not just feel cared about, usually are cared about on a personal level and feel connected and warm and all of those things.
Yeah. Okay, good strengths for the S-type leader. Let's talk about challenges. We've got 3 of those here for you. First one is that they may struggle to make decisions because of how it might impact people and how people will feel about the decision. And so this is where we begin to, get into areas in which the S-type leader might be kind of hamstrung in how far they can take something or how quickly they can move on something, which can just cause a lot of problems if the church doesn't have the ability to go ahead and make decisions, work through sometimes some difficult situations, and come out better on the other side. Then the S-type leader might hold that back.
Totally, and they're very guilty sometimes of saying, "Well, people are saying X, Y, Z." Who are people? Be specific. And so they can take 1 or 2 comments from 1 or 2 people and then project those comments onto the whole church and go, everybody is thinking this. D's do this too also, but they do it in a way. Yeah. They do it to project whatever it is that they're thinking. They find 1 or 2 people who agree with what they're thinking. Yeah. And then they project that on the whole church. This is kind of the inverse of that. The S will hear a criticism and they'll project that criticism is coming from everywhere. And that's just not true. And so it can be, if you are an S-type leader or if you are working alongside one, I would encourage you to push back on this a little bit and go, don't say people, tell me who. Be specific. And do this also with D's who do the same thing. Whenever you hear this, people are saying, go, which people? How many? Exactly. Yeah. They're going to have this urge to not want to move on something unless it's unanimous. And so that's not good. It's hard to get, you couldn't get a unanimous decision on what kind of pizza to order. And so if you can't get it in the small things, you're going to have diversity of thought and opinion on the big things too. And so obedience and faithfulness to what Jesus is calling you to do as a church is often going to require you to lead, even sometimes from a minority position on something. Think Moses, think Nehemiah, think Jesus, for heaven's sake. And know that leading often looks like leading from the minority view. And doing what is right is not always doing what is popular. And that is very difficult for an S-type leader to accept. Yeah. Hey, good use of the phrase "for heaven's sake." Perfect. It couldn't have been better. Our second challenge is the S-type leader having the inability to scale this level of care that they're able to put in on their own into the congregation, into relationships. And this, for you and I, this is like obvious, like, well, yeah, you've got these close relationships, or you're able to manage, 50 people with close relationships. But really, how does that work when you're 300 or 600 or 1,200? Well, to be honest, for you or I, if we want care to happen in a church that we're working with, we would have to have systems because we're terrible at it. So we have no choice but to delegate that. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yep. But because they're personally good at it, they have a hard time letting it go. Yeah, for sure. I worked with a church once, and this was several years back, and I wasn't at the time thinking, oh, well, this person is bringing this up because they're an S-type leader, but that's absolutely what happened. And they were of the opinion that the pastor should know everybody in the church, like be able to know a name. He literally thought having flashcards would be a good idea for the pastor to get to know everybody's face and name and be able to have a relationship with them. And my question was, what number would that work? What, you have to, if that's your expectation, is this 200? Is this 400? And that simple push of like, how many people should the pastor be able to memorize and know, he couldn't answer that. There was no way for him to answer that. Right.
but the heart behind what he wanted is understandable from an S-type leader. I mean, to have the expectation of a pastor to have that level of care. So in that regard, I totally get where he's coming from, but it doesn't scale. And so this is where an S-type leader has got to have the awareness to employ systems so that other people also with his gifting and personality type can allow this level of care to scale. And gosh, what a win for the church when they're able to make that happen.
Totally. I think that this is difficult for S-type leaders to understand, but if you don't develop systems of care, then that in and of itself is uncaring, right? Because what if something happens to you and you're unavailable, and then there's a need in the church? That person is going to go without care, or the church grows beyond your capacity to care, to meet a need. And what are you going to do? Are those just now those people are left out? They're not going to get attention. And so the trick, I think, is for S-type leaders to understand that they need systems because it's actually more caring, not less, to have them in place. The S-type leader, though, is usually not a skilled manager. So to put on the S-type leader, hey, you build these systems of care. They're not going to be able to do that. They're not even going to see how that would be possible. So you're going to have to probably partner them up, particularly with a C-type leader, probably, and have them build the system, and then use the S-type leader to be the one who's creating maybe the content or the teaching to show, to emulate, here's how you do this. And, to be honest, AJ, the ceiling on it is variable because individual people's capacity is variable. So one pastor may only have this skill set to effectively minister and pastor to 100 people. Maybe it's 200, maybe it's 300. I grew up in a church in Dallas that the guy who was leading it when I was a kid, and the church was 1,500 people or so, I would think, somewhere around there. But he knew everyone, and his personal capacity for care was sky high. Wow. I mean, my dad had not a actually adopted mom, but was like a mom to him. He grew up in foster care and had a mother figure in his life that was really influential to him. And when she passed away, Pastor Ashcraft was at our house. What do you need? And all these things, in a church of 1,500 people. So his personal capacity was extremely high. But I'll tell you what, when he retired from our church, all of that fell apart very quickly, and the church never recovered. And so you have to understand that if you really care about the church, you need systems that can outlive you outlive your tenure, and can also outscale your personal capacity.
Wow. Yeah. That right there, that is probably, if you don't remember anything else from this episode, remember that. If you truly care about the church and you're an S-type leader, you're doing the church a disservice if you don't develop in a team environment systems to scale your level of care to outlive you and your tenure there. For sure. That's the golden nugget for this week. Don't turn it off yet. We've got a couple more things for you. Our third challenge is the S-type leader is one that would avoid conflict and hard conversations when it's somebody having something against or with them that's involved. Now, two people in conflict with one another, the S-type can get involved in that, and he can help navigate that between third parties. But when it's involving him, especially as a leader, maybe having to deal with somebody that's not happy about a leadership decision, something like that, their tendency is going to be to figure out how to then make that person's feelings improve. And if the only way to make the person's feelings improve is to maybe walk back the decision or to temper it some way so that it's more palatable, they may do that. That might be what they would naturally do, which is not a good quality on the leadership side of things. It's a good quality on a relationship side of things, but not from a leadership perspective. So this is one of the challenges that the S-type leader is always got to be watchful of, and it can make problems for other leaders in the church that maybe were involved in the decision-making process. If the S leader is out maybe trying to make it sound not quite the way it is, because then the others are like, hold on, what happened? We made a decision about this, and now you're telling these people something different. And so it can actually, them avoiding conflict or confrontation can create more conflict and confrontation with others. So this is probably the biggest challenge for the S leader.
Yeah, they tend to be really passive aggressive. You're like, what are you saying? What are you doing? You know, they can be really difficult, backhanded compliments, things like that. They're going to avoid saying and doing a hard thing. It doesn't mean that they don't act in ways that bring disunity. They do. They do it in a veneer of nice. People will go, oh, he's really nice. And then you look back and you go, wait a minute, I just got, what just happened? You know, what's really interesting, I think, fascinating about true S-type leaders. And again, most people are a blend of something and something else. So I'm talking about this in the caricature, I guess. But a true S-type leader maybe doesn't have an opinion on something. Like, you want to nail them down on what their opinion is on a decision. Do you prefer this or this? And because they're so afraid of how that might make other people feel, they may tell one person one thing based on their opinion, and then turn around and a second later have a different conversation and say that their opinion is the other thing. And very likely don't even realize that they've done that. I mean, it's almost pathological, you know, where they're like, but you just advocated for both sides of this thing. What are you talking about? They get confused. They're not sure. So that can be, it's disorienting, I think, if you're working alongside an S-type leader and they're the point person, because you're like trying to get them to make a decision on something, trying to get them to express an opinion, trying to get them to say and do a hard thing, and they're just never going to do it. Maybe think Michael from The Office, you know, like he's always looking for the win-win-win type situation. And that's always going to say whatever he has to say for something not to be hard in that specific moment, but creating huge problems for everyone else that people have to clean up.
Yeah.
That's what an S will do.
Yeah, that's pretty good. He was always in that situation of, you know, maybe not fully thinking something through or not considering all perspectives. So one person gives you some information, you're like, gosh, you're right. Okay, here's how I'm going to respond to you. And then the next person, they present another angle to you, and you're like, oh gosh, I didn't think about that. Yes, you're right. That would be it. And avoiding then the chaos that ensues in the wake of those two conversations. Yeah. Hopefully
Totally.
You don't have too many Michael Scotts in your churches. Hopefully you're not.
Hopefully
Michael
not.
Scott.
Yeah. Again, he's a caricature, right? But
yeah, right.
If you can envision the kinds of situations he gets himself into by playing two sides of an issue, or just trying to do something so that a person will like him, that's what an S-type leader will do. You'll be like, why did you do this? And it's just because they wanted them to like them, and that's really important to him. Yeah. And at the same time, all the sweetness that you get from Michael, you're like, man, he's really a sweet guy. He really cares about people. That's an S-type leader too. So if you want a caricature of an S-type leader, it's Michael Scott.
Yeah. All right, Scott, how about a few keys to success for our S-types?
Man, coming full circle, I think back to our teaser, the clear call to pastoral leadership from Jesus to Peter is feed my sheep. And this is something that as an S-type leader, I think you probably do well if that's you. You know people, you love people, you care for people, and you genuinely want to feed them with the truth of God's word, and with a tender heart. But be on guard. Indecision and a lack of healthy conflict can feel in the moment like you're caring for somebody, but you're actually doing a disservice. So be sure that you surround yourself with other people who are going to push you to take bold steps of faith in leadership while you continue to emulate the Good Shepherd's heart to care for the least of these and the people in your congregation.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, we're glad you joined us again this week on our third of our 4-part series on the DiSC, talking about the S-type leader. And hey, thanks for all you S-types out there that are really doing a great job of connecting with people and showing the love of Jesus to them. The church needs you, and so don't stop doing that. But if you need to work on some skills, maybe there's a few things that you could learn. This was episode 138 of the Church Revitalization Podcast, which means you can go to malphursgroup.com/138 to read today's show notes. There's a link there also for the YouTube version of this. If you're listening to the audio, we have the video version, and we always welcome you to maybe use that in a team environment so that your team can improve their skills together. But we're glad you were with us. We'll see you next week.